In the mountains of southern West Virginia, there are places where the fog never fully lifts. It rolls through the valleys in the early morning, settles between the ridgelines, and clings to the trees like something unfinished, like a memory that refuses to fade. If you stand there long enough, really stand still, you start to feel it. Not just quiet, not just nature, but weight. Because these mountains have seen something most Americans have never been told about. In 1921, deep in these hills, thousands of men picked up rifles and went to war. Not against another country, not against invaders, but against their own government. This wasn't a protest. It wasn't a strike. It was the largest armed uprising in the United States since the Civil War. And it didn't start with soldiers. It started with coal miners. Men who spent their lives underground, digging the fuel that powered an entire nation, while living in conditions most people today wouldn't believe were real. Men who were poor, isolated, and dismissed by the outside world. Men who would later be labeled with a word that carried more judgment than understanding: hillbillies. But in August of 1921, those same men became something no one expected. They became an army. And to understand how that happened, you have to understand the world they were living in. Because this story doesn't begin with guns. It begins with control. In the early 1900s, coal wasn't just important. It was everything. It powered factories. It fueled railroads. It heated homes. And in the Appalachian region, it created entire towns almost overnight. But these weren't normal towns. They were company towns. And on the surface, they looked like opportunity. There were houses, stores, schools, jobs, everything a family might need to survive. But underneath that surface was a system designed for one purpose: control. The coal company didn't just provide jobs. It owned the houses the miners lived in. It owned the stores where they bought food. It owned the land beneath their feet. And in many cases, it influenced the law itself. So when a miner woke up in the morning, he wasn't just going to work. He was stepping into a system where every part of his life was already decided. He would leave his company-owned home before sunrise, walk roads coated in black dust, and head toward the mine. And then he would go underground, into darkness, into tight tunnels carved through rock, into a world where every breath carried risk: gas leaks, cave-ins, explosions. One mistake, or sometimes no mistake at all, and a man could be buried where he stood. And yet, every day, they went back, because they didn't have a choice. When the shift ended, they would emerge from the mine covered in coal dust, their faces barely recognizable, their lungs filled with particles that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And then they would go home. But even home wasn't truly theirs, because everything they depended on was tied back to the same company they worked for. And nowhere was that control more visible than in the way they were paid. Many miners weren't paid in real US dollars. They were paid in scrip, company-issued currency, money that wasn't accepted anywhere else. You couldn't take it to another town. You couldn't save it in a bank. You could only spend it in the company store. And that store, it was owned by the same company that paid you. So the system looped back on itself. You worked for the company. You were paid by the company. You spent your money at the company. And if prices went up, you had no alternative. Food cost more. Supplies cost more. And slowly, without realizing it, many miners found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt, working longer hours, taking more risks, just to stay afloat, just to survive. And if you ever tried to leave, you didn't just quit your job. You lost your home, your access to food, your place in the community. Everything disappeared at once. So most men didn't leave. They stayed, even when they knew the system was stacked against them, even when they knew it wasn't fair, because the alternative was worse. And over time, something else settled into these towns. Fear. Not loud, obvious fear, but quiet, constant pressure. Coal companies didn't rely on trust to maintain control. They relied on enforcement. Private guards, often called coal and iron police, were brought in to monitor the towns. They carried weapons. They watched conversations. They showed up at meetings. And they made it clear, without always saying it directly, that resistance would not be tolerated. If miners talked about organizing, they were noticed. If they tried to form unions, they were targeted. Some were fired, some were evicted, and some were beaten. In a place where everything was controlled, even the idea of pushing back felt dangerous. So for years, most people didn't. They endured. They adapted. They survived. But pressure doesn't disappear. It builds. And by the early 1900s, that pressure had been building for decades. Accidents in the mines continued. Men were injured. Men were killed. And often, little changed. Because from the company's perspective, the system was working. Coal was being produced. Profits were being made. And workers, no matter how exhausted or replaceable, kept showing up. But outside of the coal fields, something was beginning to shift. Across the United States, labor movements were gaining momentum. Workers in factories, railroads, and industries were beginning to organize, to demand better conditions, better pay, basic rights. And slowly, that idea began to reach the mountains. The United Mine Workers of America started sending organizers into coal towns. At first, quietly, carefully, because they knew what they were walking into. They held small meetings, spoke to miners one-on-one, shared a message that, for many, felt almost impossible to believe. You don't have to live like this. At first, it sounded dangerous, maybe even unrealistic, because for generations, miners had been taught, directly and indirectly, that this was just how life worked. But the idea didn't disappear. It spread, from one man to another, from one family to the next, until it became something harder to ignore. And that's when the coal companies responded. Not with negotiation, not with compromise, but with force. Union organizers were immediately targeted. They were followed, threatened, driven out of towns. Miners who joined unions were fired, blacklisted, marked in ways that made it nearly impossible to find work anywhere else. Families were evicted from company housing with little warning, sometimes in the middle of the night. Belongings thrown outside, doors locked behind them, and in some cases, the violence escalated even further, because this wasn't just about stopping a movement. It was about maintaining control, and control, once threatened, rarely gives way peacefully. What started as an effort to organize for better working conditions quickly turned into something much more intense. A standoff between workers who were beginning to realize their power, and companies that were determined not to lose it. And somewhere in the middle of that tension, something began to change. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, quietly. The miners started to see things differently. They started to recognize patterns, to understand that the system around them wasn't neutral, that the rules weren't designed to protect them, and that waiting, hoping, enduring, wasn't leading to change. It was just extending the same cycle. And once that realization takes hold in a group of people, it doesn't go away. It grows. It spreads. Until, eventually, it reaches a point where something has to give. And in the coal fields of West Virginia, that point was getting closer. Tensions were rising in places like Mingo County. Union supporters were being arrested under questionable charges. Local law enforcement, often aligned with coal interests, began enforcing rules selectively, cracking down on miners, protecting company operations, blurring the line between law and control. And for the miners, something became clear. There was no outside system coming to fix this. No neutral authority stepping in. No safety net. The system they were living under was the system they were expected to accept. And that realization changed everything. Because once people stop believing the system is fair, they stop waiting for permission to challenge it. And that's where this story begins to shift. From survival to resistance. By the time the tension reached its peak in the coal fields of southern West Virginia, the line between law and control had almost completely disappeared. What had once looked like a structured system, jobs, housing, order, was now revealing itself for what it really was. a closed system, one that protected power at the top and suppressed everything beneath it. And for the miners, that realization wasn't theoretical anymore. It was personal. It showed up at their doors, in the middle of the night, when families were forced out of their homes with little warning, when men were arrested not because they had committed crimes, but because they had asked questions, when meetings were broken up by armed guards who didn't answer to the community, but to the companies. And in that environment, something began to shift, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. The miners were no longer just reacting. They were watching, learning, connecting, because even in isolation, word travels in the mountains. Stories move from camp to camp, from porch to porch, from one man to another, and those stories started to carry a different tone. They weren't just about hardship anymore. They were about injustice, about patterns, about a system that seemed designed to keep them exactly where they were. And as more men began to see that pattern, something else began to form alongside it. Resolve, the kind that doesn't come from anger alone, but from clarity, from the understanding that nothing is going to change, unless something forces it to. And in the coalfields, that pressure was building faster than anyone outside the mountains realized. In Mingo County, the situation grew more volatile by the day. Union supporters were being targeted more aggressively. Arrests became more frequent, and the presence of armed enforcers became more visible, not just in towns, but along roads, near homes, around gathering places. It was meant to send a message. Stay in line. Don't organize. Don't resist. But messages like that don't always have the intended effect. Sometimes they do the opposite, because eventually people stop seeing enforcement as protection and start seeing it as occupation. And once that shift happens, the relationship between authority and the people changes completely. The turning point didn't come from a single moment. It came from a series of events that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. Men were detained without fair process. Union organizers were driven out, or worse. Families were left without shelter, and trust, whatever little remained, began to collapse. But there was one event that carried more weight than the rest. One moment that spread through the coalfields faster than anything before it. A confrontation that ended in violence. Details traveled quickly, even when they weren't fully clear. What mattered wasn't every fact. What mattered was the meaning people took from it. That the system wasn't just unfair. It was willing to use force to stay that way. And once that idea took hold, it didn't stay contained. Men began gathering in larger numbers. At first, it looked like conversations. Groups standing together longer than usual. Meetings that stretched into the night. But those gatherings started to change. They became more organized, more intentional. Decisions were being made. And one of those decisions would alter everything that came next. They would no longer remain passive. They would move. They would act. And if necessary, they would fight. At first, that idea sounded extreme, even dangerous, because for generations, these men had lived under systems that discouraged exactly that kind of action. But the conditions had changed. And once people feel like they have nothing left to lose, the calculation changes with them. Rifles were not hard to find in Appalachia. Hunting was part of life. Firearms were tools. Familiar. Accessible. And slowly, quietly, those tools began to take on a different role. Men began bringing them to meetings, carrying them more openly, not as a show of aggression, but as a sign of readiness, a signal to each other as much as to anyone else, that things were no longer the same. And then came the moment where planning turned into movement. Word spread that groups of miners were organizing to march, not randomly, not aimlessly, but toward a specific destination, toward Logan County, a stronghold of anti-union enforcement, a place where resistance had been met with some of the harshest crackdowns. And the message was simple. They were going to confront it. As the plan spread, something remarkable happened. More men joined, not hundreds, thousands, from different towns. different camps, different parts of the region, men who had never met each other, now moving toward a shared purpose, and they needed a way to identify each other, because in a landscape filled with uncertainty, knowing who stood beside you mattered, so they chose something simple: red bandanas, tied around their necks, visible, recognizable, a way to distinguish themselves in a situation that was quickly becoming unpredictable, and over time, that symbol would take on a meaning far beyond its original purpose. But in that moment, it was practical. It said, "I'm with you. We're in this together." As the numbers grew, so did the organization. This wasn't a chaotic uprising. It was structured. Leaders began to emerge. Men with experience. Men who could coordinate movement. Who could keep groups aligned. Who could think beyond the immediate moment. Routes were discussed. Timelines considered. Supplies gathered. Food. Ammunition. Basic necessities for movement across rough terrain. Because this wasn't a short trip. And it wasn't without risk. The terrain of southern West Virginia is not forgiving. Steep ridges. Dense forests. Narrow passes. It's the kind of landscape that can protect you, or trap you, depending on how it's used. And both sides understood that. Because while the miners were organizing, they weren't the only ones preparing. Local authorities had already begun reinforcing their positions. Sheriffs aligned with coal interests were gathering their own forces. Defensive lines were being considered. High ground identified. Because if the miners were going to move through those mountains, they would have to pass through controlled territory, and that meant confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an expectation. Still, the miners moved forward, not because they believed it would be easy, but because turning back meant accepting the system exactly as it was, and that was something they were no longer willing to do. So they marched, through valleys, across ridgelines, along railroad tracks and dirt roads that connected one town to another, and as they moved, more men joined. Some stepped out of their homes and fell in line. Others traveled miles just to catch up, because by that point, this wasn't just a local issue. It was something bigger, a shared response to years of pressure that had finally reached its limit. And for the first time, the balance of power in the region began to shift. Not completely, not yet, but noticeably, because thousands of armed men moving with purpose changes the equation, and people began to notice. Towns along the way watched as columns of miners passed through, some in silence, some offering support, some unsure of what would come next. But everyone understood one thing. This was no longer a hidden conflict. This was something visible, something real, something that could not be ignored. And as word spread beyond the mountains, attention began to shift toward West Virginia, because what was happening there wasn't just a labor dispute anymore. It was becoming something the country had not seen in decades. An armed movement, organized, motivated, growing, and moving toward confrontation. And as the miners approached the ridgelines near Blair Mountain, the final stage of this story was beginning to take shape, because on the other side of those mountains, forces were waiting, prepared, armed, and determined to stop them. By the time the miners reached the outer ridgelines of Logan County, the atmosphere in southern West Virginia had completely changed. What had started as scattered conversations in coal camps had become something far larger, a moving force. Thousands of men traveling through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States. Ridges stacked behind ridges, forests so thick they swallowed sound, valleys that carried voices farther than they should have traveled. And through it all, the miners kept moving, not as individuals anymore, but as a column, a formation, a growing, shifting network of people bound together by a shared decision. They were no longer going to wait for permission to be treated differently. They were going to force the issue into the open. And that decision meant something irreversible was approaching, because on the other side of those mountains, the response had already begun. Sheriffs in Logan County and surrounding areas had been preparing for days. Word of the miners' movement had reached them early, but at first It was hard to believe the scale of it. Small groups of armed men. That was manageable. But reports kept growing. Hundreds. Then thousands. Then coordinated movement across multiple routes through the mountains. And suddenly, what had once seemed like a local labor dispute started to look like something else entirely. Something organized. Something expanding. Something they could not ignore. So defensive lines were formed. Positions were chosen along high ground. Because in mountain warfare, elevation is everything. Whoever controls the ridges controls the valleys. And Logan County sat in a position that made it a natural stronghold. The ridgelines around Blair Mountain became the focus. Natural barriers turned into defensive positions. And men were placed along those positions with orders that were simple, but heavy. Do not let them pass. As the miners advanced, they began to notice changes in the landscape around them. Tension in the air that wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. Signs that they were being watched. That movement was being tracked. That they were no longer moving through empty space, but through contested ground. And still, they kept going. Because at that point, stopping wasn't really an option anymore. Not mentally. Not socially. Not structurally. The momentum had built too far. The groups of miners began to tighten their formation as they moved deeper into the region. Scouts were sent ahead. Messages passed back through runners. Communication was constant, even without modern tools. Because in terrain like this, awareness was survival. And then, they reached the point where movement slowed. Not because they had stopped, but because they had arrived. The ridgelines near Blair Mountain rose sharply ahead of them. Dense forest climbing upward into layers of fog and shadow. And somewhere beyond those ridges, defensive forces were waiting. No one needed to say it out loud. Everyone understood. This was the point of contact. The place where everything would either break or escalate. The miners began to spread out along the base of the ridges. Some took cover behind trees. Others crouched near natural depressions in the ground. Weapons were checked. Lines of sight were identified. And for a brief moment, there was a strange kind of stillness. Not peace, but anticipation. The kind of silence that comes right before something irreversible happens. And then it started. At first, it was distant. A sharp sound echoing through the hills. Then another. And another. Gunfire. It carried strangely through the mountains, bouncing between ridges, making it difficult to locate exactly where it was coming from. And within seconds, the silence was gone. What followed was not a single battle in one place. It was scattered engagements across miles of rugged terrain. Small groups encountering resistance at different points along the ridges. Fire exchanged through trees, across slopes, down narrow paths where visibility was limited and movement was difficult. The miners pushed upward in some areas, trying to gain elevation. Defensive forces held their positions on higher ground, using the terrain to their advantage. Neither side had perfect visibility. Neither side had complete control. And that made the fighting chaotic, confusing, disorienting. Sound mattered more than sight. A shot could echo from 3 different directions at once. Smoke hung in the trees. The forest became fragmented into pockets of engagement rather than a single unified battlefield. But even in that chaos, patterns began to form. The miners were not retreating. They were advancing in waves, regrouping, repositioning, trying to find weak points in the defensive lines. And the defensive forces were doing the opposite, holding, stabilizing, trying to prevent breakthroughs along the ridges. As the hours passed, the scale of the situation became undeniable. This was not a brief confrontation. It was sustained, coordinated, expanding, and word of it began to spread beyond the mountains. Telegrams were sent. Reports were filed. Local authorities realized quickly that what was happening was far beyond their capacity to contain alone. And so attention moved upward, toward state-level coordination, toward federal involvement. Because when thousands of armed civilians are engaged in sustained conflict with local authorities across a large region, it stops being a local issue. It becomes a national one. Back on the ridges, the the miners continued to adapt. They used their familiarity with the land to navigate terrain that outsiders struggled to move through. Narrow trails, hidden paths, old logging routes that cut through dense forest. They weren't fighting like a traditional army. They were fighting like people who knew every contour of the land beneath their feet. But even that advantage had limits, because the forces they were facing were not static. They were organized, reinforced, and increasingly coordinated as the conflict expanded. As daylight faded and night began to settle over the mountains, visibility dropped dramatically. The forest became darker. Sound became more pronounced. Movement more difficult to track. And in that darkness, the nature of the conflict changed again. It was no longer about advancing in large movements. It became fragmented, localized. Every ridge, every slope, every narrow pass became its own isolated engagement. And through it all, the miners kept pressing forward in places where they saw opportunity, and holding ground in places where they were forced to. But what was becoming clear, even in the chaos, was that this was not a quick confrontation. It was a sustained conflict across terrain that did not favor easy resolution. And as the situation stretched into longer periods of engagement, the weight of what was happening began to settle in. Because this was no longer something that could be explained away as unrest. This was not a protest. It was not a strike. It was not a temporary disruption. It was a full-scale armed uprising unfolding in real time in the mountains of West Virginia. And the longer it continued, the more impossible it became to ignore. By the time the fighting stretched across the ridges near Blair Mountain, it had already gone further than anyone in the region expected. What began as a movement had become a sustained conflict. What began as resistance had become a war in everything but name. Gunfire had echoed through the mountains for days. Smoke had settled into the valleys. And the reality of what was happening was no longer contained to the coalfields. It had spread. Reports reached state officials, then federal authorities. And with each new update, the same conclusion became harder to avoid. Local forces were not going to contain this. Not quickly, not cleanly, and not without help. Because the numbers mattered. Thousands of armed miners, spread across difficult terrain, moving with purpose, was not something that could simply be dispersed with warnings or small-scale enforcement. It required something larger, something coordinated, something that carried more weight than anything the miners had faced so far. And so, the response began to shift. At first, it was preparation, discussions, assessments of what options were available, what resources could be mobilized, what risks were involved in escalating the situation further. Because this wasn't a foreign conflict. These weren't external enemies. These were American citizens. And that made every decision more complicated. But the longer the fighting continued, the fewer options remained. Eventually, the decision was made. Federal involvement would move forward. And with that decision, the balance of the situation began to change. Not immediately, not all at once, but in ways that the miners would soon feel. The presence of federal authority carried a different kind of weight. It wasn't just local enforcement. It wasn't just company-backed defense. It was the full structure of the government stepping into the conflict. And that changed the psychology of everything. Because up to that point, many of the miners believed they were confronting a system that was local, contained, something that could be challenged directly. But now, the scale had expanded, and with that expansion came new pressure. Reports of federal troops moving toward the region began to circulate. Information moved through the camps, through the lines, through the scattered groups still positioned along the ridges. Some dismissed it, others took it seriously, but no one ignored it, because even the possibility of that level of response meant something had shifted. And at the same time, new elements began to appear in the sky above the mountains. Aircraft. Not large numbers. Not constant. But enough to be noticed. Enough to signal that the situation was being monitored from above. For many of the miners, it was something they had never seen in a conflict like this. Movement in the sky. Observation from a perspective they couldn't match. And whether those aircraft were there for reconnaissance or intimidation, their presence had an effect, because it introduced a new dimension to the conflict, one that the terrain could not protect against. The mountains had always been an advantage. They provided cover, familiarity, a sense of control, but they could not shield against everything, and as that realization set in, the dynamic began to change again. On the ground, the fighting continued in bursts, not constant, not evenly distributed, but persistent. Engagements flared up in different areas, then faded, then reappeared somewhere else. A pattern of movement and resistance that stretched the conflict across space rather than concentrating it in a single point. And in that kind of environment, sustaining momentum becomes difficult. Communication becomes harder. Coordination becomes strained. And over time, pressure accumulates. Because while the miners had numbers and determination, the system they were pushing against had resources, structure, time. And as those resources began to concentrate around the region, the weight of the response became more visible, more organized, more consistent. For some of the miners, the realization came gradually, in conversations, in observations, in the growing awareness that the situation they were in was becoming something they could not outlast, not because they lacked resolve, but because the scale of opposition had shifted beyond what they could realistically confront. And that realization didn't lead to a single decision. It led to many, made by individuals, by small groups, by men who had to weigh everything in front of them against everything behind them. Some began to step back, not all at once, not in a mass retreat, but in gradual movement away from the front lines. Others held their positions longer, unwilling to give ground, unwilling to let the moment pass without pushing as far as they could. But even among those who stayed, the pressure was undeniable, because once federal forces begin to fully arrive, the outcome of a conflict like this becomes less uncertain and more inevitable. Eventually, the presence of federal troops on the ground made that reality clear. Their arrival didn't just add numbers. It changed the structure of the conflict, introduced authority that carried legal weight beyond local jurisdictions, and for many miners, it forced a question they could no longer avoid. What happens if this continues? Because this was no longer just about confronting coal companies or challenging local enforcement. It had become something larger, something that carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. And slowly, the movement began to dissolve, not in defeat, but in recognition. Groups broke away from the ridges. Men began to return to the paths they had come from, back through the forests, across the valleys, toward the towns they had left behind. And as they moved, the scale of the uprising began to shrink, until what had once been thousands became hundreds, and then fewer, until the conflict, as a sustained force, came to an end. In the aftermath, arrests followed, investigations, charges brought against those identified as leaders or participants. The system reasserted itself. Control was restored, at least on the surface, because what had happened in those mountains could not simply be undone. It had exposed something, not just about the coalfields, but about the country itself, about the limits of pressure, the consequences of control, and what can happen when people reach a point where the cost of staying silent feels greater than the risk of speaking out, or acting, or resisting. And while the uprising did not result in immediate victory for the miners, it changed something that would carry forward. It forced attention, forced recognition, forced the realities of the coalfields into a national conversation that could no longer be ignored in the same way, because it had gone too far, been seen too clearly, felt too deeply, and over time, that pressure would contribute to changes, not instantly, not perfectly, but meaningfully. Labor laws would evolve, protections would expand, the idea that workers could organize, that they had rights, that conditions mattered, would gain ground in ways that had once seemed impossible. And in that sense, The miners had done something that reached beyond the moment they were in. They had shifted the trajectory, even if they didn't see the full result of it themselves. And today, the mountains are quiet again. The ridgelines stand the same. The forests have grown back over places where men once stood with rifles in their hands. And if you walk those hills now, you might not see any trace of what happened. No clear markers. No obvious signs. But that doesn't mean it's gone. Because history doesn't always leave visible scars. Sometimes, it leaves weight. Something you feel, even when you can't fully explain why. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of what happened there. A moment when ordinary men decided they had reached their limit. A moment when resistance became action. And a moment when the United States government was forced to respond to its own people. Not in theory, not in debate, but in reality. And the most surprising part of all of it is how few people know it ever happened. This wasn't ancient history. This was America. Just over 100 years ago.